Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you. As you know, if you were here in November, I gave a report of what I discovered as I walked with you through a whole bunch of focus groups, interviews, data collection, and so forth. And for those of you who are here, would probably conclude that the overall message was not good. In fact, it was basically, the punchline was that what you've been doing for over 40 years isn't working. The decisions and the best thinking and application that you've done has resulted in a decline for at least 40 years, going back 45 as far as I could see record-wise, and probably even beyond that, but we didn't have the data to look at it. And so the key question is the decisions that you're making now will determine your future. And there are two paths. It could keep going down to a slow death. Or, I believe, it could be a story of redemption and God's grace and mercy and His sovereignty to see new life emerge in a way that will be rather dramatic. That's what I believe the future will be. But the choices you have to make need to be made now. You can't put it off any longer. 40 to 45 years of ignoring it is long enough. It is time to take some action. So I spent quite a bit of time with the lead team in January. In fact, I think the presentation and interaction we had was well over 2.5 hours, I think, of interaction. I'm not going to give you a 2-hour interaction tonight. Do I hear an amen? But I will give you some of the key insights of recommendations that I made to the lead team. The lead team then processed those things and will be making recommendations to you for consideration. Ken Baker will be presenting those immediately following my talk. You will have time in March and April to process, interact, pray, and then come back at the April Presbytery meeting to decide whether you want to trust God for a new future. I'm telling you this, that this is not something to be entered into glibly, because I'm not here to tell you it's going to be easy. In fact, it's going to be quite difficult. Remember Lewis and Clark? Those explorers that were great, excellent river navigators. And they were commissioned by the president to go find the Northwest Passage. And so they started going up the river, very confident that at some point they'd find the end of it, and then they'd go over the hill, and they'd find a riverway going down the other way to the Pacific Ocean. And so they got up and they were going exploring, doing their thing that they knew so well to do, to be those river navigators. And they got to the end of the river and they now were expecting to go over the hill to find the river going down to the Pacific Ocean. And lo and behold, they saw the Rocky Mountains. The challenge that they faced at that point was they were good navigators of rivers. They knew how to survive in that kind of environment and they flourished in it. They were experts. But now they needed to become mountaineers. And they knew absolutely nothing about mountaineering. They could have just turned back and said, we ran out of water. But no, they pressed on, innovated, learned as they go, got some help from a native woman that was strategic in helping them get over the mountain, probably saved their lives. The church, as we've known it, is good at river navigation. The challenge that you face, and this is why it's not going to be easy, the challenge that you face is it's now mountaineering. And we don't exactly know how to do that. But if God told us to do something, do you believe that it's possible? Do you believe that God is sovereign? And when He told us to go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, and surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age, do you believe that if He said that He actually thought it was possible? I do. So if God commanded it, it must be possible. So I'd like to just share with you some of the seed thoughts that I gave to the lead team that they processed, which then will get crafted into some more formal recommendations, which Ken will present to you. There may be some overlap in the presentation because they processed what I shared, and then they came up and shaped it and tweaked it to fit your context well. First and foremost, the way forward is to seek God together as you refocus on the mission. First and foremost, this is a spiritual issue. To tell God that you're sorry that you let it go for so long and that you were not fulfilling the role of elders. Measuring the results of the mission, because when you go back in history in the Presbytery at its best, they were people that were striving to be in community together, to be in covenantal relationships, and to strive for God's mission and to consider how to stimulate each other to love and to good deeds and to press on. And that's what elder meant. The ruling elder was to measure the effectiveness, to measure the actual results and compare it to the actual mission that God wants to be done. And that's so well summarized in your documents as the great ends of the church. We could capsulate that to say making disciples, apprentices of Jesus, who are lovingly obeying what God has commanded, fulfilling the great commandment, loving God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, loving your neighbor as yourself, and helping others to become followers of Jesus. That's what Presbyterians were founded on, and that's what was happening in the early days. In 1809, I believe it was, when the first Presbytery in the United States was formed in Philadelphia. What were they engaged in? They were engaged in covenantal relationships to press on with a mission to move God's mission forward. And there was some interaction and challenging and encouraging each other and figuring out how to move it forward. Got to go back to that. Seek God. Pray. We want us to see that happen so that you can pass your faith on to the next generation. That it's reformed in theology and Presbyterian in governance and multi-ethnic and multicultural in scope and disciple-making oriented. That's what it means to be Presbyterian. And you have the opportunity to leave that legacy to the next generation. And I don't think there's a single person in this room that would want to say the history of the Presbyterian Church in the San Fernando Presbytery died under our watch. Because unless you change, unless there's deep change, unless there's faith to take action, that will be the history. And God doesn't want that. And neither do you. But you have to ask the question about motivation. Why do you want this? It's not good enough just so that you can have survival. That's not a good enough motivation. Let me give you one possible motivation. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news and the kingdom and curing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest field." The motivation for why to change is when you look out over the whole region of the Presbytery of San Fernando, which goes from the high deserts to across the valleys, all the way out to various places. You know the borders better than I do. But there are millions and millions of people from a whole variety of a host of ethnic groups that are like sheep without a shepherd, harassed and helpless, needing a touch of God. And when Jesus saw those crowds, what does it say? He felt compassion for them. His heart broke over the lostness of the people, over the hurting of the people. And I believe with a tear in his eye, he said, "The harvest is plentiful. It's the workers that are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to raise up laborers or workers to go into the harvest field." I encourage you to start gathering in regional meetings and start seeking the Lord and studying the scripture and getting refocused on God's mission and praying for the workers and doing prayer walks in your community and begin to open your eyes and have God change your heart and say, "God, would you break my heart over what breaks your heart?" And we can pray for these workers, these laborers. And this is one of those prayers that we don't have to say, "Lord, if it be your will." You know, I sometimes pray for healing for people. And I don't know whether it's God's will that they get healed or not. So I humbly submit my will to God's will and say, "Lord, this is what I would like, but if it be your will, please do this." This is one where we know it's God's will because Jesus told us to pray it. If you'll pray that, God will raise up the laborers. They may not look like you. They may be younger. They may be more diverse. But he loves to answer that prayer. James says we have not because we ask not. Are you asking? James also says sometimes we ask, but we don't receive because we ask with wrong motives. But I think there's a more fundamental reason why we're not praying this prayer in our churches, weekly, in gatherings, together, in the presbytery settings in smaller clusters. And it comes right out of this passage. I would suggest to you that the reason you're asking not for the laborers is because you care not for the harvest. Ask God to break your heart over what breaks his heart. When is the last time you've cried and wept tears over the lostness of people? Like Jesus wept. That's just one of the motivations. There's many others to be considering, and that's why I'm encouraging you to gather these things and get in regional meetings and do this kind of stuff. Another thing that needs to happen, you need to learn how to make disciples who make disciples. I encourage you to start a network, an experimental network, if you would, of helping learn how it is to make disciples, to live and love like Jesus, to help people to become followers, who help others to become followers, who help others to become followers. This is where It's mountaineering. And canoeing methodologies won't work anymore. But it's possible. Learn how to do that. And this is what is so wonderful about Presbyterians, because Presbyterians at their best live out Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. See, these kinds of networks, for those congregations that are willing to begin to do some experimentation, build on the good stuff that's happened with Bridges and Cyclical LA and all of that, but get it local church-based and to start to experiment in ways that actually get people out. You know, there's one church that I know that they say, we want to give away as much as we take in. In other words, they count the time that they spend, and they want to spend 50% of their time outward and 50% of their time inward. So their small groups are involved, 50% of their efforts are in building relationships and serving outside of their own group, and 50% of their time is to spend building each other up and encourage each other and all of those kinds of things. I'm not saying that's the magic figure, but that's the whole point, is to figure out how to get prioritize that and reprioritize it. And that sometimes means you have to figure out what's going to be on your stop-do list. Because I've coached people and I coach leaders all the time, and when they add something to their list that's a priority for them to do, I basically ask them this question: so what 2 things are you going to stop doing to make time for that thing that you're going to commit to right now? And that adage of add 1, drop 2 can be done for a long time and still be in the will of God. Prioritize that time. These kind of networks are basically 4 words describe them. They're intentional. It's intentional. I was just talking with somebody today, a church planter in the Houston area, and helping them to think through, okay, where are the spheres of influence you have, and who are those people in those spheres of influence, and what's your actual strategy to build connections with them and to go back and cultivate those relationships and so forth. It's intentional. It's developmental. You know, it's helping people to stretch and take the next steps. I like to use the expression that the church is like rubber bands and shoelaces. Rubber bands, you got to have enough stretch or there's no growth. No stretch, no growth. Too much stretch, what happens? You snap. So it needs to be an appropriate stretch, which will vary by person, by small group, and by congregation, right? The other key principle is shoelaces. Tie people together. Don't do it alone. Learn from each other. Learn from your failures, your stumbles. Learn from the successes. Find the bright spots. You know, begin to figure out how to do it. Be supportive. Cheer each other on. Applaud failure. If it's a good effort, you know how to do this. You've all probably been in a room where a little baby's learning how to walk. How many have lived through that? Let me see those hands. Come on. You've done it. And this little baby's there and tottering and just kind of barely hanging on, you know? And then they take one little step forward and then they flail their arm and they go down. And the crowd goes wild. Susie took a step. And little Susie's saying, man, that hurt. But I'm getting a lot of love right now. I think I'm going to try again. You understand what I'm talking about? You don't need to always succeed. You got to just be in the game. In fact, this is one of these that I've not found this kind of revitalization happens unless the senior pastor personally engages in the harvest. I've yet to see one exception to that. But here's the good news. It doesn't seem to matter whether the pastor's successful or not. What matters is they're out there trying. And when they try and are consistent in that, God changes something and it empowers others to be able to be fruitful. Supportive, and it's focused. Maintaining focus on that mission. Because that's what Jesus said. These were the last words Jesus gave. Don't forget this. This is the most important. Last words are lasting words. He says, make disciples. Teaching them, baptizing them, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded. Now see, here's how it really starts in the church. You think that the church might look like this, institutional, classic church. In today's mountaineering world, the church might need to look like that. Now let me tell you one thing not to do. Don't try to take your church here and just go directly to that. That is a great way to fail spectacularly and even fatally. The change is too hard. Now, so how does revitalization really happen? It really happens, if you look at church history, it really happens as a result of multiplication. So you see God do something new, and you see a whole thing starting to flourish and multiply. Now the church is set in a dilemma. They see that stuff happening there, and it looks like it's got life. And they're asking a question. Do I need to change? You know what often the answer is? They find something wrong with that. They're not reformed. They practice gifts and have manifestations that we dignified Presbyterians who do things decently and in order just can't do. Or whatever it is. When I was a kid, I grew up in a conservative Baptist church. Now you understand, I was baptized a Presbyterian, and I was a great Presbyterian for the first 5 years of my life. Then my father's company closed down where he was, and we moved to LA, and we ended up in a Baptist church. So you understand that I've been on a spiritual path that is not as providential as perhaps it could be. But in this conservative Baptist church that I was in, I was in junior high, and we had the Calvary Chapel movement was going on at that point. The Jesus movement was happening. And on Saturday nights down in Costa Mesa, they had concerts going on for the young people. And the teenagers and young college students would go there and enjoy the music. The problem was that they had this afterglow service where they were trying to help these young people to receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit and to speak in tongues, which a good conservative Baptist would not do. And so I remember as a junior higher listening to my pastor preach for an hour and a half once, and it was remarkable. It was a Sunday night, an hour and a half sermon. And it was on this thing called tongues, which I didn't know what they were, but I knew he's against them. But it was interesting that movement happening out there opened up the door to bring a guitar into the Sunday evening service. And out of that birthed some stuff that began to pop up alongside of the church. And it began to flourish, and then it began to then have an impact in the church itself. Here's the key thing. If you look at church history, without exception, revitalization movements do not start at the ecclesiastical center. They start at the edges. And as it begins to work on the edges, then it has a reverse effect of helping to revitalize what is, and there's some transformation that begins to happen. That's important to realize, because see, I'm not suggesting that you take your churches and blow them up. I am suggesting that you start releasing more and more people to be able to work alongside and try some new things and do some other things and see and the focus on being disciple making that makes disciples. Are you with me on this? And as that begins to work, then you can figure out how to manage the tensions that will emerge from that to occur. But it's all good stuff when people start coming to faith and lives start being changed and neighborhoods are being transformed because Jesus is now in the midst. Disciple making, priority. Another one, to transform your leadership development process. This is the big one, folks. This is a big one. Because the way in which you are doing your leadership selection for pastoral leadership is unfruitful. And here's what's unfruitful. You require an MDiv degree for any pastor. The seminary is not producing the kinds of pastoral leaders that are needed in today's mountaineering world. They were able to produce pastors to serve well in the 50s. But we've actually gone through the research to see what is the profile of a pastor. And here's what a profile of a senior pastor actually looks like. Well, this is the biblical justification, so let me start there. Paul said, "You have heard what you've heard from me through many witnesses, and trust to faithful people will be able to teach others as well." Do you see there's generations there? Paul, Timothy, faithful others, and others. 4 generations. And what was Paul was talking to Timothy, the pastor, to raise up other pastors, to raise up other pastors. It is not the job of the seminary to produce pastoral leadership. It's the job of the church. Now, I'm not against seminaries. I teach in one. I have 2 seminary degrees. But the point that pastoral leadership needs to be based upon character and competence. And 80% of what people are called to do in pastoral ministry is not being equipped through the seminary. Flat out true. I'm not opposed to seminary education. But the problem is if you make it a prerequisite so that you then only look at people that have MDiv degrees, the pool of qualified people to serve in your churches that are competent to do the job that needs to be done, which here's the profile from our research, is too small. And you're missing out on a whole bunch of people that God could use. There was a church that actually started in a 10-year period of time, started 50 new congregations. 25 of those were started by lay people. This church was organized according to small groups, and that they looked for the people that could evangelize, disciple, and raise up other leaders. And they made a list of those people and began to pray over them and ask God, who are the ones that God is calling to become church planters or pastors? And then they would go to them and say, we believe God might be calling you to become a pastor, church planter. Would you pray about that? If they got the confirmation, they'd enroll them in intensive time to help ramp them up biblically and theologically through an informal education process. They would equip them in other kinds of things to help them learn how to learn and move forward. They'd develop a church planting proposal. They would then preach and see how many people they could take with them. They would open up and preach on a Sunday night and let them bring as many people as they could. When they got up to 40 people gathered in small groups, then they'd give them a small startup budget and cut them loose. 50 churches got started in a 10-year period of time. 25 of them were engineers, teachers, other people, piano tuners, lots of different folks. Now you're saying our polity doesn't allow us to do that. Oh, yes it does. God in his sovereignty allowed you to create a loophole. And if it's in the rule book, then you can do it. It takes 3/4 vote, correct? 3/4 vote of the Presbytery to ordain somebody that doesn't have an MDiv. Now, if you think about that, now all of a sudden the prospects of pastoral and church planting leadership is wide open. Now you have anybody that's in your churches, but you know what? It could be even bigger than that. Because in a multiplying movement, do you realize that the people who are going to pastor those churches and going to start those new churches, right now as we speak, are not yet Christians? Sometimes the laborers are found in the harvest. And you win them to Jesus, develop them, and they become fruitful disciples who become leaders that then raise up new ministries. Transform your leadership development process. There's a way to do this, and it's going to be a serious kind of a thing. I'm saying don't ignore the seminary. I think that seminary education is great for in-service training, not pre-service. Now, don't throw away a good one like a Randy Lovejoy or one of those people that got a seminary degree. But you want to make sure that it's character and competence for the selection process. And raise up farm systems that raise up these pastoral leaders. But the pastoral leaders come out of fruitful disciple making. There's a lot more I could say about that, but this is a big issue. You need to manage your financial and physical assets to maximize fruitfulness. The picture of the vine. Look what's fruitful, what's bearing fruit. Put more energy there. What's not bearing fruit, put less energy there. See, here's the big picture, folks. That the mission Jesus gave us is to engage the culture, to make disciples who lovingly obey Jesus, who make disciples. Out of those fruitful disciples, you raise up qualified leaders that are equippers, which then leads to the multiplying of ministries, be it groups, churches, other kinds of different kinds of ministries. That's a way a movement starts happening. And you have to think about what's fruitful and put more in there. What's not fruitful, put less in. Now that goes counter to the way church systems think, because they tend to think those that are squeaky wheels get the grease. But I would investigate, where's the fruitfulness going on? Where are people being won to Christ? Where are disciples being made? And how could you come alongside to invest there more? How could you take internships and develop a residency program to be able to help get people really focused on the harvest and raising up disciples and groups and leaders and ministries and all of that? Because that will be the farm system out of which the turnaround will come. Now, I'm not saying to neglect or ignore the existing congregations. You want to continue to provide care for them. But I think it's important to realize the type of care you need to give needs to change. Because sometimes what people need to learn how to do is they need to learn how to cook in a different way. And yet they're holding on to the keys of the kitchen and won't release their hand. And they're wanting help, but help on their terms. And part of the way to think about this is to do a good solid assessment and then come to a covenantal agreement of how to work together in ways that will help to bring health and life wherever possible. And we're not to provide compassionate care to help them die with dignity. It's okay. John 12:25 says, unless the seed falls in the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it falls in the ground and dies, it brings forth many seeds. And you've already seen that happen in some ministries already. And so churches have lifespans. That's okay. So don't neglect the existing churches, but to say focus exclusively on the existing churches is not going to get the job done. And so to do that, it's going to require some redirection of some staff leadership to be able to do that. And Ken will talk more about that. So Ken, why don't you come and share the recommendations?
Thank you, Don. Appreciate it. We are grateful for your work on our behalf in the kingdom. I want to give you just a few thoughts from the perspective of those of us who have been trying to process Bob's recommendations for the last few weeks. I'm encouraged, as much as you've recognized some painful realities about our history, as well as the history of so many churches in this country and the Western world. One of our young pastors, Presbytery, was preaching one day. I happened to be there, and he was telling about how the local kids had been out turning the churchyard into a skateboard park. And he asked the congregation not to chase them away, but instead to reach out to them, to try to develop a relationship, to care for them. And after the service was over, a parishioner came up to him, an 80-year-old man, and said, "Pastor, I want to help. But does this mean that now I'm going to have to learn how to ride a skateboard?" I think that's a wonderful story, because what it tells me is that as much as at times we've resisted the changes that need to take place, that fundamentally we are folks who know that we need to adapt to changing circumstances and a cultural context that's very different from what all of us had been taught and what worked so well many decades ago. What Bob has laid out for us was a process that wouldn't happen immediately. It would be a 7 to 10 year forward-looking movement of those of us in our congregations, which means those of us in our presbytery. And what we want to do, what I hope we will do, is to begin to find ways to implement these recommendations. Now, right now, we've got some handouts for you. And Casey, do you have those handouts? Or yeah, if you can pass these around. Casey's got some paperwork here, and while he's, thanks guys for getting those around to us. And while you were talking, Bob, I found some of those things you were talking about were pretty painful, because I've been part of this presbytery for 31 years. I'm not the new guy who just showed up and said, well, the shortcomings must be all the result of what they've done. It's what I've done or not done, overlooked. In trying to be a faithful Christian and a faithful presbyter. But it's easy.
Also, it's also the preliminary packet you see.
Okay, all right, that's
you don't get the fluid, you got the way.
Okay, all right, very good, thanks. I want to look with you at some ways that we've tried to think about processing Bob's recommendations. And to help me remember his recommendations, I came up with a little acronym called Real Fruitfulness. I want to go over that with you for just a few minutes here. The first of the and there's some in the left-hand column there's some basically some concepts. In the right-hand column there's some application in those boxes. We don't have time to go into a lot of it right now, but I want to just give you an overview. The first principle, and this is really what Bob stated, put in some different words. We need to return to our roots. You know, our Baptist friend reminded us we need to return to the Reformed tradition and to draw on the resources of that tradition for our future ministry and our ability to reach people in the community. Tina, thank you for that wonderful story. I didn't know it was going to have that kind of impact on me the second time I heard it, but I just thought, you know, that's the providence of God at work. That's what we believe. That's part of what we hold dear as Christians. Now, there's ways to do that, and we'll be looking at some ways to do that. One of the ways to do that is just hear a story of God's great work in our lives, and that's why I wanted to see if we could begin doing that in our stated meeting. But in some of these other events and meetings, we want to spend more time in prayer. There are people praying for us tonight who are not here, who are in other places and other activities, but are stopping right now and praying for our meeting tonight. I think that's given me a sense of strength. So that's the R part of the real. The E refers to our existing congregations. You were just talking about that, Bob. We need to care for our existing congregations and offer some real opportunities for transformation. Because some of the things that we've done have been wonderful, but a number of them just haven't accomplished the goal of reaching our communities for Jesus Christ. And we know we've got the resources, we've got people who can help us to do that. And so Bob is recommending, and I certainly endorse, that be a big part of what we work on. You've got us here. It's, you know, we are just you. That's all the Presbytery is, and we are grateful for you. And at times when you need the assistance of the rest of us, we want to be there. But we want to be there in a way which really lifts up your ministry to a higher level. The A, I rewrote this. This is the part where Bob talks about the experimental network. Rewrote this a little bit to talk about the need to, what I think of as advancing the boundaries of our ministry. Last Thursday, I had lunch with a preschool teacher, a network television executive, and a bomb squad cop. Almost sounds like one of those walked into a bar jokes, you know? And these were people who were, as I questioned them, I found out these people believe in Jesus Christ. They are Christians. I asked all three of them, and I said, do you have a home church? They said, no. No, we went to churches and we were put off by them. And as they told me, I realized that the events, the experiences, the places that mean so much to you and me are barriers to some people. And they're not all non-believers. These folks were believers in Jesus Christ, and yet we'd never likely find them in a place like this, or in your congregation, your sanctuary, or the one where our family attends. So, I see that network that you're talking about, Bob, as a way to grow as disciples ourselves, which I need to do, but also to help folks that I met the other day to begin to get a sense of their own discipleship and help us to grow with them, and also to make people and to meet some of the people that they know. These are people you love to have in your congregation. And we need to grow together with folks like that in ways where people might not expect to find Christians. In the places they would at least expect us. We need to be at work, because that's what the culture is pushing us toward. in the 21st century, I believe. The L in REAL stands for this pipeline of lay leadership. And we need to develop these leaders. I was talking to a colleague, a counterpart in central Nebraska a couple weeks ago. I said, where do you get the leaders for your presbytery and your congregation? She said, we get them right out of our congregations. And she said, the reason is there's no place else to get them. People don't come to central Nebraska for the wonderful weather. They don't come for the opportunity of a movie part. They don't come for the beaches and the palm trees and the movie stars, because we don't have any of them. We've got our churches, and we've learned how to identify those people, to train them, to raise them up to be the leaders in our congregations. And I thought, okay, that's just what you're talking about there. And then the last of those 5 principles is the fruitfulness. Somebody said, instead of asking God to bless what we are doing, we should figure out what God is blessing and go do that. That's the kind of fruitfulness that I think you're talking about, so that when we see God at work in a special way, we support that and we give more intentional attention to it. Now, the final part of this, as we thought about it, is to make some staff changes. Those were your that was your recommendation, Bob. And as we had that dialogue, we realized that we may, in fact, have the person on your staff already that we need, and that's Randy Lovejoy. And you know, Randy, maybe you don't know, Randy has been working with our established churches for the past, year and a half, 2 years now? And has done a wonderful job of coming alongside those folks, training other people in the process of doing that. But now, in order to implement, if we're going to implement these recommendations, we're going to need to move him into what I call a lateral move, really, is to move him into a position where he's leading this process of change for us, but not to neglect the established churches and their needs that he has been heading up serving. So what we're proposing, and we'll give you more details about this before the April meeting, is that we move Randy from a half-time position to a three-quarter time position. And basically the half-time is what he's doing now. It shifts over to leadership of these new initiatives, and then there's a quarter of a time that he supervises some of the rest of us in responding to the needs of our existing churches, because we can't forget about those of you who got us here.